Alright, my 3 transformers came in today for this project. I'm only using one right now to test this out with. And what I have is, the other day when my other components came, in the midst of that came some of my capacitors I ordered. I have 4 2700 UF by 200 volt capacitors in parallel here to get me close to about 10,800 microfarad, in that range there. I have set up here 4 180 ohm resistors, about 10 watts each. They're in parallel to give me about 45 ohm resistance load here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to check the voltage, DC voltage, using my multimeter with the capacitor bank unplugged. And then I'm going to put the capacitor bank in there and I'm going to check the voltage. So first of all, I'm going to check the voltage with the capacitors out of the filtering. Okay, I'm plugged in now, and without filtering I'm at 26.3 volts DC. Without capacitor, around 26.3 volts. Okay, now I'm going to put the capacitor in. The capacitor bank is now in, and I'm at around 38.4 volts. 38.4 volts. That's with the capacitors in circuit. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to check the ripple voltage with and without the capacitors. That's coming next now. Okay, now I'm going to check for ripple voltage. I have the capacitors unhooked again, and I'm going to check without the capacitors first. Okay, without the capacitor, I'm peak to peak about 5 volts, about 8 times 5, about 40 volts peak to peak. And now I'm going to put the capacitors in the circuit. And now I'm going to advance this to 1 volt there on the scale, and it's about 1.4 roughly, about 1.4 volts peak to peak. Okay, so that's what I have with the 4 capacitors in parallel. Okay, now I'm using my lathe here. I'm going to turn it off, and the voltage is at around 42.9, around 43 volts. Put the lathe on, and the voltage drops about 39.7. 43 volts, 39.7 volts. And that's with the filter capacitor. Now I have it without no filter capacitor. It starts out as 68 volts. Motor running. And it drops down to 31.5. 68 volts to 31.5 volts. Okay, now I'm going to check for ripple voltage with the capacitors in the circuit. Put the motor on. Ripple voltage about 1 volt, and that's with 2 capacitors. With 4 capacitors, let's check it now with 4 capacitors. Okay, I'm now hooking this up for 4 capacitors. Okay, there's 4 capacitors now. Positive, positive, ground, negative, okay. 4 capacitors. Now we're going to check the ripple voltage. It dropped a little bit. It came down to about 0.8 volts. 0.8 volts. Now here's something interesting. Whenever I put a stall on the lathe motor until I get belt slip with 2 capacitors, I get about 4 volts peak to peak ripple voltage, and with 4 capacitors I get 3 volts peak to peak on the belt slip. So that is reducing the ripple voltage when there's a load put on the motor. So let me see how many more capacitors I'm going to need to put in this bank. Okay, I'm going to do some machining here and just check the ripple voltage. I'm going to put my camera in the holder here, and I'm going to check the ripple voltage when I do some normal machining. I put a load on the spindle. Okay, that was with 2 capacitors. Now this is with 4 capacitors. Okay, that gave me belt slip after I was machining it. Okay, so now I'm going to compare the two and see how much the ripple voltage went down from 2 capacitors to 4 capacitors, and see how many capacitors I'll need to get the ripple voltage down to a lowest value that I can get it that would be working properly for this application. So with 2 capacitors, the ripple voltage was about 1 volt. I added another 2 capacitors to the bank, and that went down to 0.8 volts. Maybe I'll just keep on adding capacitors until